This episode of The History Guy brought to you by NordVPN. On the afternoon of June 11th, 1837, a group of drunken volunteer firefighters stumbled into a funeral procession on Boston's Broad Street. Exactly what happened next is a matter of some dispute, as the Boston Post reported at the time. There are almost as many rumors in circulation as to the origin of the disturbance as there were parties engaged in it. And if that's true, it would have been an awfully large number of rumors, because the Broad Street Riot of 1837 included as many as 15,000 people. And by the time the dust and feathers had settled, the city of Boston would never be the same. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Thank you to the good folks at NordVPN for supporting the History Guy and sponsoring this episode. You know, my life's on the internet. I imagine most of your lives are on the internet too, and I personally know how important it is that you protect your data, as well as how convenient it is to have access to servers worldwide. And that's why you should take control of your internet experience today with NordVPN. And if you go to nordvpn.com/thehistoryguy and use the code thehistoryguy, you'll get a 2-year plan plus an additional month at a huge discount. And it's all risk-free with NordVPN's 30-day money-back guarantee. I like NordVPN for its amazing features. NordVPN protects your data behind a wall of next-generation encryption. You know your data is protected because NordVPN has a strict no-logs policy. They don't track, collect, or share your private data. Your data is protected non-stop with a kill switch that automatically disconnects your device from the internet if the VPN drops, so your data will not be exposed, not even for a brief moment. NordVPN lets you watch and download so much and so easily. With VPN servers everywhere, you can choose from more than 5,400 servers in 59 countries, allowing you to enjoy the internet with no limits or borders. With NordVPN, you can share large files with no hassle thanks to hundreds of secure P2P servers, and you get instant access to hundreds of streaming websites worldwide. One of the things that allows you to do is to see shows on Netflix that are available in other countries, but not the US. You can access so much programming without having to subscribe to all sorts of streaming services. For example, if you're a fan of the show 24, it isn't on Netflix in the United States, but you can watch it on Netflix Germany using NordVPN. And NordVPN is so easy to use. It's just a single click, it's simple and intuitive as making your morning coffee, and one account lets you connect up to 6 devices. So go to nordvpn.com/thehistoryguy and use the code thehistoryguy and get that exceptional deal, a 2-year plan plus an additional month at a huge discount, all completely risk-free because of NordVPN's 30-day money-back guarantee. The city of Boston underwent a period of expansion in the early part of the 19th century, with its population more than doubling from around 25,000 in 1800 to more than 60,000 in 1830. A significant percentage of this growth came from immigration. Much of that came from Ireland. After the final defeat of Napoleon in June 1815, Britain, despite being the victor, found itself deeply in debt as Europe fell into economic recession. The British response was multifold, but the effect was especially felt in Ireland. The price of foreign cereal grains decreased after the end of the war. This was perceived to be a threat to the English wheat market, and imports on cheap, that is, so below a certain price, foreign grains were banned with corn laws. The initial impact was to increase the price of food, which led to opposition and unrest in the public. But another impact was that it increased the profitability and therefore the political power that was associated with land ownership. This change in the political and economic value of land then spurred in Ireland greater use of a 1773 act called the Enclosure Act. The act gave landowners the ability to enclose land and remove commoners' access to that land. While the process was supposed to be a cooperative process with a procedure, the landowners were often able to manipulate the committees making decisions, and the impact of the Corn Laws gave even more incentive to use and abuse the process. The result was a wave of Irish immigration. Thomas O'Connor, a professor emeritus of history at Boston University, described the effect in his 1995 book, The Boston Irish, A Political History. In Ireland, the passage of the Corn Laws that kept up the prices of local grains, the protective tariffs that made it impossible for manufacturers to maintain full-scale production, and the far-reaching acts of enclosure that turned poor farmers off the land, all had crippling effects on an already depressed economy. Despairing of a prosperous future, growing numbers of craftsmen, tradesmen, shopkeepers, and small businessmen decided to abandon their shops and their workrooms, gather up their meager savings, and move with their families to America. But the wave was not just craftsmen, it was also poor farmers. Many turned off their land by the enclosure laws. O'Connor continues. Joining their countrymen in this post-war exodus came a number of immigrants from the farming areas in the South, many of them young men in their 20s and 30s who could see little future. There was a reason that the people fleeing Ireland often chose the United States. The new republic had a unique appeal, O'Connor writes. When the first wave of immigrants wrote home to their friends and relatives of how new laws and state constitutions in that young republic enabled Roman Catholics to enjoy equal rights, the rush was on to leave Ireland and go to America. And many of those coming to America chose the city of Boston. The city was in the midst of a period of growth. Between 1823 and 1828, legendary Mayor Josiah Quincy III undertook an ambitious plan to expand the city and revitalize neighborhoods, notably creating the marketplace around Faneuil Hall, still called Quincy Market. The improvement of roads, sewers, and the dock area, and the economic growth involved meant that there were many jobs for the new Irish immigrants, and many neighborhoods, especially in the area of the bustling Boston Dockyard, became Irish neighborhoods. While not all the Irish immigration was Catholic, the Irish Catholic population boomed. O'Connor notes the numbers. From only a few hundred when the first congregation was formed, the number of Irish Catholics in Boston had risen to some 2,000 by 1820, and to more than 5,000 by 1825. By 1830, it had passed the 7,000 mark. That means that by 1830, nearly 1 in 9 Bostonians was an Irish Catholic. Large-scale immigration often engenders a nativist response as cultures collide, but in Boston that was initially relatively muted because these new Irish immigrants at first weren't particularly involved in politics. But that all changed with the rise of a new politician, the war hero and populist, Andrew Jackson. Jackson won a plurality of the electoral vote in the presidential election of 1824, but was denied the office because of the corrupt bargain between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. The outrage over the bargain partly propelled Jackson to a landslide victory in 1828. The rise of Jackson represented a new entry into politics for the Irish population of Boston. O'Connor argues that Jackson's populism and rustic virtues appealed to the Boston Irish, and they started becoming more politically active. That, in turn, inflamed the growing nativist opposition to the rising influence of the Irish voter. O'Connor contends, the increasing number of Irish Catholics during the late 1820s and early 1830s, combined with what some observers saw as their expanding influence in political affairs, was more than enough to rekindle old fears about the supposed threat of Roman Catholicism to Anglo-Saxon traditions. Slowly, that nativist opposition turned into rising violence. In 1825, the Boston Advertiser reported disgraceful riots taking place almost every night by gangs who broke windows, damaged furniture, and destroyed several small houses in the Irish sections of the city. A notable example occurred in the August 11, 1834, Ursuline Convent riots, where a mob of Protestant workingmen, spurred by rumors that Catholics and Unitarians were conspiring against the working class, ransacked and then burned a convent and school run by Catholic Ursuline nuns in the nearby city of Charleston to the ground. In official church history called the arson, the most disgraceful outrage ever perpetrated in New England, and the most tragic event in the history of the church here. The children and nuns escaped unharmed, but the building was destroyed. While 8 men were brought to trial for the capital offense of arson, none were convicted. But this conflict wasn't only grounded in differences in culture or religion. The working class people of Boston saw these new Irish immigrants as workforce competition. And that would become even more important in 1837, when the economic boom that had attracted so much Irish immigration came to an abrupt halt. The Panic of 1837 was originally spurred when the Bank of England raised interest rates in order to rebuild cash reserves after a period of speculation. This caused a rippling financial crisis that was magnified by decreasing cotton prices. Interconnected trade and banking compelled U.S. banks to also increase rates. Decreased lending and the cash of cotton prices spawned a wider panic. The situation became a crisis on May 10th, when banks in New York suspended payments in specie, that is, gold and silver, causing a devaluation of paper currency. Banks failed, profits and wages went down, and unemployment went up. Now the working class of Boston was struggling for work, and it was easy to blame the Irish who were competing for wages. Additionally, many people blamed Andrew Jackson, who had perhaps escalated the problem by refusing to recharter the nation's central bank in 1832. As the Boston Irish were now associated with Jackson, they were similarly seen as responsible for the downturn. And a center of nativist, anti-Irish sentiment in Boston was with Boston's volunteer fire companies. Jack Tager, a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, wrote in his 2000 book Boston Riots, 3 Centuries of Social Violence, that, like other American cities, Boston had a small group of paid firemen who managed 1 or 2 engines, plus several volunteer fire companies who competed to put out fires. The volunteer fire companies had begun back in the 18th century, and as Tager notes, by the 1830s, volunteer companies had evolved into elaborate social clubs, where drinking and brawling were as important as answering fire alarms. The companies, which competed over which could reach a fire first, were often the center of disorderly conduct. Tager notes that undisciplined, they often caused civil disorders. But they were not just poorly trained and undisciplined, they were almost exclusively composed of Yankees, coming, as a Catholic Church history described them, chiefly from those poorer strata of the population among whom hostility to the Catholics and the Irish was fiercest. And so the men who fought the fires in Boston had common cause with, and some of them might have even been the same people who had committed arson at the Ursuline convent in 1834. And this tension between the Boston Irish and the Yankee volunteer firefighters would boil over 184 years ago today, on June 11th, 1837. The men of Engine Company No. 20 had returned from fighting a fire on Roxbury Street. Many of the men apparently went home, but some decided to stop at a nearby pub, one that was, it appears, illegally open as it was Sunday, and it was against the law in Boston at the time to sell liquor on Sunday. Meanwhile, a group of some 100 Irishmen were assembling for a funeral procession. When the Yankee firemen stumbled into the Irish mourners, according to a June 15, 1837 edition of the New York Herald, the land of steady habits lost all its peaceable character. The Bangor Daily Whig and Courier of Bangor, Maine, gave a surprisingly tepid description of the state of the trouble. Engine No. 20 encountered an Irish funeral procession, and, somewhat interrupting its progress, warm words ensued. Peter F. Stevens, news and features editor of Boston Irish Magazine, wrote in his 2008 book Hidden History of the Boston Irish that the instigator might have been an engine man from Company 20 named George Fay, who had lingered longer than his comrades over his cups. A cigar dangling from his lips, he either shoved several of the Irishmen or insulted them. In 1888, Donahoe's Magazine, a Catholic publication, wrote, "The collision resulted in a bloody and fierce fight, which, says the reporter, extended its fiery track through Purchase Street to the corner of Broad. It began through who should take the sidewalk. The fight over the sidewalk turned into a general melee as the men of the engine company jumped to support Fay, but the fire company, being greatly outnumbered, was pushed back to their station. There are at least 2 stories as to what happened next. By some accounts, the Irish broke in and took control of the station, but by others, the crowd dispersed, and the event would have ended had not Company 20 foreman W. W. Miller not lost his head completely. But the men of Company 20, the New York Herald reported, prepared to resent their defeat, rang their own bell, and sent a man to ring Reverend Mr. Young's bell, as if for an alarm of fire. The bells called out the nearby fire companies, thinking there was a fire. The Herald continues, the plan was immediately successful in calling out number 14 Cataract, which accidentally fell in with the procession at the corner of Summer and C Streets. But as the hearse was not in sight at that point, the company was not apprised that the large amount of people they ran in among were connected with the funeral. The Irishmen, however, supposed that they had come to renew their former conflict, and commenced an attack on the men at the ropes. At first, the fire company seemed to have been outnumbered, but the Herald said the firemen defended themselves as well as they could. But other companies began to arrive, and the Yankees were joined by other working-class Bostonians. The riot gained steam. The Herald wrote, "The missiles flew in every direction, and clubs and shillelaghs were wielded right manfully. Handcarts were used to convey ammunition in the shape of bricks to the scene of action. In the meantime, the Irish women and children were shrieking and wringing their hands, and this, together with the oaths and menaces and ferocious aspects of the combatants, the cries of victory and the groans of defeat, presented a spectacle of confusion, of riot and bloodshed which was never before witnessed in this city." Tager noted that the scope of the riot was eventually huge. The Broad Street Riot of 1837 involved nearly 15,000 people, almost 1/5 of the city's population, although the majority were cheering a corps of maybe 800 brawlers. Eventually, the Yankee numbers grew, Donahoe's reported. The Irish maintained their ground and only yielded inch by inch to overwhelming numbers, retiring, pursued by the multitude. O'Connor expounded, for more than 2 hours, the battle raged up and down the streets of the lower part of the city where the immigrants lived, with an estimated 10,000 people watching. 800 men fight it out with sticks and stones, bricks and cudgels. This would have been a significant enough event, but as the fire companies started to break off and return to their stations, Donahoe's described a frightening shift in the fighting as a different class of combatants taking their places, mingled in the affray. This new group, which the Boston Post described as lads about 16 and 18 years of age, then engaged in what the paper described as an outrageous attack. As the Irish gave ground, the dwellings occupied by their countrymen were attacked, and windows and every movable article were demolished. The paper lamented, "There is no reason whatever to believe that the houses thus assailed were occupied by the Irishmen thus engaged in the affray." Feather beds were ripped open, and their contents poured out the windows, forming an exact imitation of a snowstorm. The Daily Whig and Courier wrote of a very worthy and unoffending citizen who was sitting in his chamber, engaged in reading, when the noise of the rioters drew him to the window. The man rushed downstairs and bolted the door, but the rioters broke in. The paper continued, "Everything in that house is now in ruins. Not a single article escaped. Even a cooking stove was thrown down and broken in pieces." Donahoe's noted, "The usual recklessness and disregard of life exhibited in all such scenes were displayed in every direction." Finally, Donahoe's recalled, "The mayor, Samuel A. Eliot, was seasonably on the spot and called out the military. Portions of several regular companies were assembled at Faneuil Hall. When the militia units arrived," the Post reported, "they cleared the streets instantly, and no further violence was committed after their appearance." But the damage had been terrible. The Daily Whig and Courier described the scene the following day. "The street was covered ankle deep in the feathers and straw from the beds that had been sacked, and the furniture destroyed and thrown from the windows. Loose stones and brickbats covered the pavement in immense quantities. Many houses are left without a pane of glass in the window sash." The paper estimated the total loss to be over 3,000 and reported peculiar cases of suffering are numerous. 29 families have been more or less afflicted by this lawless attack upon their houses. There are at least 122 people composing these families, 79 of whom are women and children, and the greater part of those having been deprived of their clothing, save those articles they happen to be wearing at the time of the attack. Surprisingly, despite the size of the riot and the amount of the damage, no one is known to have died in the Broad Street Riot, although Tager notes that the lack of records from the police departments and the hospitals means that the number of people who might have died later of their injuries can never really be determined. Even in bringing the peace, the Boston Irish were still victimized. As O'Connor notes, most of the militia units that were called up were Yankees. And so 36 Irishmen were arrested, but only 4 Yankees. All 4 Yankees were acquitted by Yankee juries, but 3 of the Irishmen were convicted and sentenced to several months of hard labor. And then the Boston City Council later determined that they didn't have the authority to reimburse victims of the riot. The riot had a significant effect on city policy. First, it spelled the end of the volunteer departments. Tager notes, "The elite's response was to mitigate the threat that was posed by the volunteers by ending the system. In September, Mayor Eliot announced the establishment of a professional paid fire department, thus ending the long rule of the volunteer companies. Moreover, the city had no municipal police department at the time, employing just a city marshal and a few watchmen. In 1838, partly because of the Broad Street Riot, a bill was passed in the General Court that allowed the city to appoint police officers, paving the way for the creation of a formal police department." But perhaps the largest impact of the riots and period of violence against the Boston Irish was that it resulted in a unique political culture in a city where today, people of Irish descent are the single largest ethnic group. Thomas O'Connor said of the Irish of Boston, "They had fled the poverty of Ireland, survived the Atlantic crossing, made it safely ashore, and established new roots in a new land. Like it or not, they were going to stay right where they were, and no one was going to make them leave." O'Connor contends that it was the years of bitter and unyielding conflict between Yankees and Irish Catholic immigrants that eventually led to the Irish political dominance over the city of Boston. He says, "Irish politicians developed a distinct political philosophy that often shifted from traditional democratic leadership to local neighborhood populism." I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history. And if you did enjoy, feed the algorithm by making a comment or clicking that like button. If you have suggestions for future episodes, please send those to our suggestions email box. Check out our webpage at thehistoryguy.net. And of course, we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo and check out our merchandise at teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes of Forgotten History, all you need to do is subscribe.